Hi, and welcome back to the layout. Today we're going to be taking a look at Saluda grade and how Norfolk Southern and previously Southern Railway ran trains over the steepest mainline grade in the United States. With the ruling grade of 5%, in some parts as close to 7 or 8%, the train crew couldn't make it up the hill in one shot. So, they'd have to stop at the bottom of the hill, split the train into cuts, and take each cut of 10 to 15 cars up separately, an operation that later became known as the Saluda Triple or tripling the hill, and that's what we're going to look at today. Today we're going to follow train W77, a freight between Spartanburg, South Carolina and Asheville, North Carolina, which ran via the W line in Asheville, North Carolina. And we see it crossing Fall Creek Trestle here as it approaches Melrose, the siding at the bottom of the grade. Also, interestingly, at the bottom of the grade there was a runaway track, and you can really appreciate the steepness of the grade here looking up the grade at Melrose. And here's a quick picture of the prototype runaway track, and typically the switch would be lined for the runaway track unless sensors indicated that the train was under control. Here in downtown Saluda at the top of the grade you can see the main line on the left and the siding on the right, and that's just a little bit of reference for how the prototype is laid out and how we'll describe the operations on the layout here today. The Saluda grade is no longer in operation today. Norfolk Southern abandoned the line in 2001, but the tracks are still in place. It's located just north of the South Carolina-North Carolina border, with north being uphill towards the mountains of western North Carolina and south being downhill towards the upstate and flatlands of South Carolina. The dispatchers lined W77 into the siding, which is typical for freight train operations on the hill when it was in use. The engineer would bring the train to a stop so that they could disassemble it and take it up in cuts. Once the train was stopped, the conductor would walk back and uncouple the first cut, and rather than walking back all the way to the front of the train, it was very common to see the conductors riding on the rear of the cut all the way to the top of the hill and top of the grade at Saluda. And this was just to save time and from having to walk the train multiple times during the operation. So with the first cut ready, W77 is ready to make its first run up the Saluda grade. The grade itself between the siding at Melrose and the siding at downtown Saluda was less than 3 miles, but the tracks themselves gained over 600 feet in elevation, so it was an incredibly steep but fairly short trip up the mountain. It was only about 10 or 15 minutes until the train would reach downtown Saluda, where they'd be able to drop off the first cut and then return southbound to pick up the second cut for another run up the hill. Here W77 comes through downtown Saluda, and this is the crest of the hill. Just like the prototype, this is an incredible place that you could and still can visit today. It really gives you a neat perspective, being the crest of the hill, to look down the tracks, which really drop off and go down the mountain. It just gives you a neat perspective for just how steep this grade was, and what an incredible feat of engineering it was, and still is today, even though the tracks are no longer in use. And a few notes about the layout. Although it's a prototype freelance layout that isn't exactly modeled after Saluda, a lot of the scenes and locations on this layout were inspired by the grade, and so with a few tricks and camera angles, I've been able to recreate the Saluda grade here on our layout. Here at Pace's Crossing, this is a pretty common and famous location on the Saluda grade. Uphill trains would stop here to disconnect the first cut, second cut, and third cuts, to then head back down the mountain to pick up the rest of the train. Also, downhill or southbound trains would stop at Pace's Crossing to test their brakes or set the retainers before heading down the mountain, and that's an entirely separate operation which we'll look at on another day. With the first cut of cars tied down in the Saluda siding, W77 is going to take its power back out onto the main line and run back southbound light power to pick up the next cut of cars. We're back at the bottom of the grade at Melrose, and here we see W77 as it comes downhill and approaches the siding. The dispatcher would line the light power into the siding where they would be able to couple up to the second cut of cars. Once coupled and disconnected from the third cut and the OK from the conductor who would be on the rear of the cut, W77 is going to make its second run up the Saluda grade. Now, just to give you a little bit of perspective and why it was such a struggle for trains such as W77 to make it up the Saluda grade, other common grades and rail lines in the country, such as the Tehachapi Pass and the Tehachapi Loop, had an average grade of 2%, whereas here, a ruling grade of about 5% for 3 miles and even more in some parts. Gives you some perspective on why these unique operations had to happen to get these trains up the steep grade. Here's another famous location on the Saluda grade, which is known as Sand Cut. About halfway up is an incredibly tight cut where the trains made a sharp L turn to go through a cut and continue heading down the mountain. An interesting note of operation here is that downhill trains would have to reduce the amount of dynamic brakes to go through this cut to ease the stress and forces on the rails. When W77 arrives back into downtown Saluda in the top of the grade with a second cut of cars, the dispatcher again would line it into the siding. But if you recall, the first cut of cars was also left on the siding. There was a crossover halfway through the siding which allowed the train to pull up behind the first cut with the second cut. They would then uncouple the cars and the locomotives would pull back onto the main line. Here, with the engines on the main line next to the first cut of cars and the second cut of cars left in the siding behind the first cut, the light power would then be able to run back down the mountain once again to pick up the last and final cut to complete the Saluda triple. We're back at Pace's Crossing, and W77 is now arriving with the last cut of cars at the top of the hill. This time, the dispatchers lined W77 through Saluda on the main line. They're going to leave the last cut of cars on the main line to reassemble the train in the order that they arrived in. So they'll tie down the last cut and then proceed northbound to the end of the siding. They're going to pull through the switch, and since Saluda and the two sidings on either side of it are controlled by CTC and a dispatcher, they'll stop, request permission from the dispatcher to enter the siding, and once the switch has been thrown and the signal's been given, they'll proceed backwards to couple up to the first cut of cars and start to reassemble the train in the order that they arrived in. Now back on the siding, W77 will couple up to the first cut of cars. They will release the handbrakes and then reverse those back onto the second cut of cars. If you recall, the second cut was left behind the first cut on the siding, and then the power went back onto the main line through a crossover. That crossover is going to be lined straight. They'll couple onto the second cut of cars and then pull forward with both first and second cuts of cars out of the siding and back onto the main line. Once out of the siding, the dispatcher will line the north end switch back for the main line, and the train crew will reverse the first and second cuts onto the last cut of cars which was left in the siding. Then the entire train will be assembled, brake tested, and ready to make its last and final part of the journey towards Asheville Yard. Successfully over the mountain and up the Saluda grade, we see W77 arriving at Asheville Yard. This is the control point at the east end known as Biltmore, where both the Norfolk Southern S lines and the W line, which has the Saluda grade, converge at the Asheville Yard. Here W77 is coming off the W line and has a restricted signal into the yard at Biltmore. The wood chip cars on W77 originated in South Carolina and Georgia with wood chips that are destined for the paper mill in Canton, which is going to be featured in an upcoming video in the operations of P31. There's also multiple cars like the last tank car, which has fuel for the Asheville engine shops, and other cars which are destined for western North Carolina and points farther which will be distributed on other freight trains. We catch W77 one last time here at the East Yard offices as it pulls into Asheville Yard. The crew's going to bring the train into the assigned yard track at Asheville, and then cut off the power and take them to the engine shops, where they'll be turned off, serviced, and fueled for the next day's trip. Tomorrow, the same engines will run as W78, down the mountain back towards Spartanburg with another freight train. That's an entirely different set of operating procedures, which is just as interesting. Retainers have to be set, brakes have to be tested, and trains have to operate at less than 8 miles an hour as they descend the steep grade. For now, I hope you enjoyed just a little bit of information about the W line, the Saluda grade, and how Norfolk Southern and the Southern Railway operated trains over this incredible grade. Until next time, I'll see you later, and thanks for watching.